So we consider ESG investing, because investment, it is genuinely kind of a BFD. Sorry, bad joke. That's what we got here. Anyway, so ESG investing, it's considering factors related to environmental, social, and governance of the corporation itself. There have been a long history of people worrying about ethical considerations about their investments, along with lots of social dynamics trying to ensure, say, that rich people feel the proper amount of guilt about their wealth. Many world religions have had varying degrees of worry about, say, getting paid interest. Plenty of institutions and individuals have worried about how to ethically invest. But there's also a movement to convince people, correctly, that the best investment portfolio is a broad index, something like the S&P 500. Most people are bad at investing, and so cannot really hope to beat the professionals. So just invest in all the companies. All can have different meanings, but whatever. But that runs into issues that some of these big companies seem kind of bad. Investors want the benefits of diversification, but they also want some restrictions on which companies. There have been calls for investors to look at not just a company's bottom line, whether it made a profit or not, but its triple bottom line. Profit, along with environmental and social bottom lines. Companies began to consider their CSR, corporate social responsibility, to be part of their mission. People wanted to put their money into sustainable investing, to somehow both make green and be green. Some people want to prioritize co-religionists, or at least companies that in different ways accord with their religious beliefs. Some companies prioritize DEI efforts, and we've been seeing the political pushback on that. Now, the E part of ESG is for environmental. Many of the elements of environmental considerations are pretty easy to measure. Not necessarily really easy, but at least straightforward. How much CO2 did the company emit? How about other greenhouse gases? Other pollution? Water use? In many places that's a scarce resource and also not properly priced. Scope 1 emissions are directly made by the corporation. Scope 2 are emissions from energy purchased by the corporation, such as the electric power to run all the computers. Scope 3 are other emissions due to corporate actions. Scope 1 emissions can be most easily measured. Again, not perfectly easy, but easier. Scope 3 are really difficult. Scope 2, that's in the middle. But for all these measures, it's not clear how or if there are trade-offs. Lowering some pollutants might take more energy and so more CO2 emissions. Is that good or is that bad? Now, the S part of ESG is for social factors. These are tougher to measure than the E factors. One of the early considerations was whether a company invested in a sanctioned country, such as apartheid South Africa. Does the corporation prioritize human rights, both for its own employees and society as a whole? Do they have a good record of occupational health and safety? Do they have good community relations? Do they promote diversity, equity, and inclusion? That used to be relatively uncontroversial, but recently has become more fraught. Does the company make weapons? Although that, too, recently had some change of perspective since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, making weapons to help Ukraine fight against autocracy might be a good thing. Or, depending on which government official is making the call, that might be bad again. Finally, the G part of ESG, for the corporate governance. This encompasses lots of standards of ethical business practices, like not bribing, not contributing to corruption, so upholding standards of different countries' governance, and lobbying. It includes labor relations, perhaps if the union has a seat on the board, the diligence with which the company follows regulations, and some more mundane aspects of corporate governance, such as executive pay, amount and how it's determined, the structure of the company's board in terms of the length of office and how often there are elections, etc. It's all some complicated stuff. With all these metrics in 3 different categories, it's relevant to ask, how do we balance all these considerations? Some companies might, for example, have good E but bad G. Is that worse than bad E and good G? Commonly, many investment groups just outsource. Vanguard manages people's money, and they know that if their customers want ESG options, they got to give it to them. So they take some outside group's list of good companies and offer an ESG fund that invests in those. Or rather, they created a bunch of different funds, each of which uses a slightly different list of which companies are good, and then they offer the whole bunch to investors. Now, in terms of results for investors, lately it's been the case. Tech stocks have been pretty high scoring according to ESG, and also posting pretty good returns. Reasonable people debate about the extent to which that's just luck or evidence in favor of ESG investing. Certainly, this has all created more data. There are now companies that provide data on a range of ESG factors. Some of those names like Refinitiv, MSCI KLD, or Sustainalytics. While the basic outline of ESG is getting settled, it leaves some questions hanging. Why ESG investing? Many companies consider that their main goal is to maximize profits, although they do have considered latitude for judgment about short-term and long-term. But other companies consider more than just profits. But we should be clear about the why, since often the other aspects are aimed at different audiences. Some companies might want the people who buy their products to be happy with the company's mission. A coffee roaster using sustainable, organic, fair trade coffee beans wants to persuade consumers to spend extra to buy those beans. Other aspects of ESG might be directed at employees, and a company might need to have good partnerships with local politicians, so maybe they support local charities, the food bank or the museum. But do those folks believe they can get a higher return by prioritizing ESG? Or are they willing to take a little lower, maybe, as long as the company is doing good? There are various arguments that ESG investments perform better, since ESG considers more long-term factors, not just quarterly earnings. Getting back to the coffee roaster example, usually they try to persuade customers to pay a bit more because they value sustainable or organic or fair trade. If sustainable or organic fair trade beans were also cheaper than conventional beans, of course everybody would buy it. ESG investing honestly sometimes muddles these arguments. I won't get too far into it, but leave you the understanding that it's really complicated and it all depends.